Thank you so much for having me. It is so great to be at Brown virtually. um, it's so cool that you're organizing this course. And of course, thanks to everyone else that tuned in from wherever you are to come to this talk. Really appreciate it. Um, yeah, so I'm just gonna admit I've been feeling a little sorry for myself recently. Living a pandemic, I have to worry about my physical health for kind of the first time in my life. Yeah, I have to keep track of my mental health, not for the first time, but it's kind of a full-time job, and it's just like my basic. I just can't do the stuff I want to do to live the life I want to live. Um, Fortunately, I don't have it that bad. I'm relatively privileged and I haven't had to grieve for anyone yet. But it's sobering to know that pretty soon I'll probably have to do that too. So I'm not sure it's the best way, but one of the ways I've been dealing with that, with the stress right now, is to appreciate the ways in which I'm really astronomically lucky, even considering everything that has happened. Because most of the years of my life haven't been like this. I've felt entitled pretty much all the time, not just to my physical safety, but to my emotional and spiritual fulfillment. I live a privileged life, and like many people here, I got to go to a liberal arts school. I had fun, I studied, and I was also kind of given a one-way ticket to the upper class. I live in a incredibly wealthy and powerful nation, and I'm a member of the world's wealthiest and most powerful species. So the fact that I'm struggling a little to meet my needs right now, it's really an exception for me. But it's the rule for most of the inhabitants of our planet. And this presentation is about some of the ways that we can work towards changing that and giving a better life to the vast majority of our planet's inhabitants. So before I go any further, I just want to explain what I mean by welfare and what I think it means to really care about welfare and to put that into practice. Sorry, I'm having a bit trouble switching between applications here. There we go. Okay. So I would define welfare as the net value of an individual's subjective experiences. So you could also call it well-being or quality of life or the balance of happiness and suffering. I think it's important to ask who has welfare, even if grammatically it's a bit of a weird way to construe the question. But let's start with the easy ones. So a rock, first of all, does not have welfare. You can kick a rock as hard as you want and it won't care because a rock doesn't have a way to care. Puppies, on the other hand, do have welfare. Studies show that if you kick puppies, they don't like it. The more you care about welfare, the less often I recommend you should kick puppies. In fact, I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb, just don't kick anything with a backbone. There is an emerging scientific consensus that most or all vertebrates can feel pain. So that definitely means mammals and birds. It might also include the rest of vertebrates like reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Personally, I think it seems likely. There just hasn't been as much research on those species. It's a lot less clear right now which invertebrates feel pain. So octopuses certainly seem to, but barnacles seem not to. And then insects like this dragonfly are somewhere in the middle. And it's an open scientific question right now whether they can feel things. One thing we are sure of is that welfare is only a property of individuals. So an abstract grouping of things cannot have welfare. So a species can increase or decrease in population, but the species itself isn't feeling happy or sad about that increase or decrease. Similarly, an ecosystem can look more or less like it did in 1492, but the ecosystem itself doesn't prefer one state over the other. It's the individual animals in the ecosystem that have preferences about the state of that ecosystem. So, of course, it's totally possible to care about wild animal welfare in addition to caring about ecosystem preservation or biodiversity conservation or any other sort of value. And I don't want to dismiss those in any way through my talk right now. But because I'm going to spend the better part of 40 minutes talking about welfare, I think it's important to know why I think this is a good metric to strive for, a good thing to value. And it's important to note too that it's different from those other values of biodiversity conservation or ecosystem preservation, right? So just like in American politics, I value Americans having liberty and I value Americans having public health, but I realize that promoting liberty and promoting public health require very different things. Sometimes they might conflict with each other, and I wouldn't assume that increasing one of those things would necessarily increase the other thing. So getting back to welfare, what I appreciate about this perspective is that it gives us a way to see the world through others' eyes. Of course, any attempt to leverage our privilege to help those who are less privileged is going to leave us vulnerable, at least, to some degree of paternalism, right? Just by very nature of that power dynamic that is motivating our action to begin with. But by focusing on the lived experiences of wild animals, we get a systematic way to correct our biases. So just to get personal for a minute, speaking of biases, I'm probably more guilty than most of coming to conservation with a pretty colonialist idea about nature. So I, all my life I've been an animal lover and a conservationist, and I loved backpacking and canoeing and rock climbing, and I really saw wilderness as something that needed to be set apart from society. I assumed it existed to serve the needs of the wealthy class, especially the recreational needs, right? Nature is for hiking in. And I hated the idea of other humans in my wild playground, unless, of course, those humans agreed to give up their autonomy and live out my fantasy of the noble savage. So for me, wild animal welfare is a perspective that's a useful check on my impulse to use nature for my own ends. It's a way to ask whether my approach to conservation is really serving the best interests of the animals I'm affecting. And it asks that question on the exact terms that matter to those animals. Welfare, by definition, is the set of things that matter to those animals. So my least favorite part of checking my privilege, far and away, is how awkward it makes me feel when I do it. When I consider other points of view, I tend to see problems I didn't see before, and not only do I see them, but I feel them, and I feel complicit in their existence and continuation. So I think one of those kinds of discomforts is worth talking about here. When I had a more colonialist view of nature, I saw nature the way my rich ancestors saw their hunting parks. Anything humans did to interfere with those hunting parks, especially if those were poor humans, was evil and had to be undone. On the flip side, anything nature did in the absence of humans was sublime and the perfect sort of thing to write poetry about while taking an afternoon tea. But I don't think that's how animals in the wild see their world. When a kangaroo burns to death in a fire, it doesn't care whether the fire was caused by anthropogenic climate change. And it won't be comforted to know that fire is actually a natural part of many Australian landscapes, to which many plants are well adapted. Looking through the kangaroo's eyes is uncomfortable precisely because it means that we humans are no longer at the center of the story. Wild animal welfare is not just about undoing the harms that humans do to nature so that we can feel good about ourselves and our virtuousness, but it's about preventing any kind of harm that might befall wild animals so that they can feel good themselves. All right, that is enough moralization for a few slides at least. I appreciate you bearing with me. Let's get quantitative, or maybe we don't have enough data right now to be quantitative, but we can get analytical, right? So as you know, effective altruism is a social movement that is all about doing good better. One of the foundational insights of effective altruism is that which cause area we choose to work on or donate to is a huge factor in how much good we end up doing. So to get a broad sense of which cause areas have the highest potential, we want to get a sense of three basic things: the scale, the neglectedness, and the tractability of that cause area. So I'm going to make the case that through this framework, wild animal welfare, I think, has the potential to be one of the top cause areas for effective altruists at present margins. Let's start with scale. This is how big the problem is. We can break that up into intensity of the suffering and the quantity of individuals affected by the problem. So starting with intensity, We don't really know right now how good or bad life in the wild is, but there's reason to believe that it's pretty awful for a significant percentage of animals born into the wild. They have to deal with starvation and disease, exposure to the elements, predation, competition, sexual oppression, and the list goes on. It seems like it would be a hard life. It's also worth noting that life in the wild tends to be short. Most animals that were born in the past year are already dead. And you have to remember that modern humans are unusual on this earth. For most animals, infant mortality is the rule and not the exception. This frog is more typical. They probably had about 1,000 siblings back when they were just tadpoles in a pond, but most of those siblings probably died when they were just a few days or weeks old. So every time you see a frog, you're not actually seeing a normal tadpole's life. You're seeing the lucky winner of an exceptionally cruel lottery. That brings us to the question of quantity. So it's hard to wrap my head around these numbers. I have tried a bunch of times. I could probably try harder, but I'm still not good at it. So if you'll bear with me, the only way or at least the best way I know how to do it so far is to kind of warm myself up with some smaller numbers first. So let's take an easy one. 7.8 billion current human population, right? And now for keeping track, let's put that on a number line, right? So let's imagine a number line where 7.8 billion is equal to 1 inch, or about the width of a quarter. Okay, so if you stacked up the entire human population on this number line, you'd get a line an inch long. Okay, so on that same number line, the farmed animal population, right? So actually this is just animals that are in factory farms right now, being pretty systematically tortured for the convenience of meat production and egg production, fish production. That would be about 114 billion. That's about 14 inches, or the width of this laptop. Fun's not the right word. Interesting aside, 114 billion seems to be in the ballpark of the same number of humans that have ever lived through all of history since we started calling ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens. So that, yeah, if you were to line up all the humans that ever lived on this number line, you'd get a line about 14 inches long. Finally, we can start getting to wild animals. So let's talk about wild vertebrates first, right? Those are the mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles. These are the animals that we're very confident are sentient. And if you were to line all of them up, you would get 10 trillion of them, which would be about 100 feet long, or about as long as a basketball court. So imagine for a minute, let's stop for a second here. Imagine standing at one end of this basketball court, right? Looking up at the net above you, and then trying to see at the far end of the basketball court a quarter that someone placed on the ground. And that quarter represents the entire number of individual human lives that are being lived right now. And all the space between you and that quarter represents the number of lives that are being lived by the animals that we know are aware of their lives. That's pretty mind-boggling to me, and to be honest, this is where I get lost. I don't think I can really wrap my head around that. Like at this point, I'm like, okay, it's big, but we're gonna push it one step further. We're gonna talk about wild land arthropods, right? So these are not all of the invertebrates, just the ones with exoskeletons. So insects, spiders, stuff like that. There are about 100,000 trillion of these. And if you're gonna do this to scale on the same number line where the whole human population is an inch long, then you get a line that conveniently is almost exactly as long, just using this rough number, but whatever. This line ends up being about exactly as long as it would take for me to walk from this house in Massachusetts where I'm staying during the quarantine, all the way back to my house in Brooklyn, my little apartment there where I fled a couple months ago. That would take about 69 hours to do that walk, Google Maps tells me. And then at the end of that walk, I would try to climb up onto the rooftop and get out my binoculars, and I would try to see the quarter back in Boston that represents the entirety of human experience. So here is a picture with just zoomed in a little bit, see if that helps you see the quarter any better. All right, we get it. So it's a lot of animals, but who's working on it right now? So as far as effective altruist organizations that are explicitly devoted to this problem, there are fewer than 20 people, I would say, working full-time on this. So there's my organization, Wild Animal Initiative. Animal ethics was founded prior to us. They're focused a little more broadly on movement building and kind of ethical advocacy, whereas we're a little more focused on the research side of things, which I will get to, believe it or not. We're also lucky enough to enjoy the collaboration of several researchers at Rethink Priorities, and Animal Charity Evaluators has written a blog post here or there, and I'm pretty optimistic that they'll end up putting more and more of their efforts towards wild animals. But again, this is fewer than 20 humans on Earth to deal with, what was it, 10 trillion wild vertebrates? It's a lot. And so, of course, we're not totally alone, right? So there are all those conservation groups and biology researchers, and a lot of the people working for those organizations share these same values. A lot of them are doing very relevant work that will be helpful to us, but I wouldn't say that they are working on exactly this problem because, as we talked about before, most of traditional environmentalism is focused on biodiversity conservation or ecosystem preservation or things like that, which might be valuable things, but they're just different from wild animal welfare. Two big differences I think are worth pointing out is one, so there's a focus on welfare, right? The focus on the quality of the animals' lives rather than the quantity of animal lives. And then another is the focus on scale, right? So because we're interested in individual experiences, we want as many individuals having good experiences as possible, as few individuals having bad experiences. That kind of naturally draws us towards working on more numerous animal populations, which by definition are more common animal populations. Often neglected animals like fish or insects or city pests. And many wildlife conservation organizations, for a variety of reasons, tend to focus on the larger, more charismatic species that, while they're influential in their ecosystems, there are just fewer of those animals in terms of total numbers. Okay, so big problem, not enough people working on it. That alone doesn't mean we should work on it, right? There still needs to be something to do. So the next question is tractability. How tractable is this problem right now? Is there a solution in hand? And I want to acknowledge that there's not a lot we can do right now in terms of putting shovels in the ground, getting our hands dirty, making a difference, seeing the smile on those bugs' faces, right? It's pretty different from several other effective altruist cause areas in that respect. We just don't have hugely cost-effective programs right now, at least not many of them. I'll get to some of them later in this talk. But I think the way to think about this is not to confine ourselves to what we can do right now. We should also consider what we can do in the future. So science and technology are going to continue to improve. Ecosystems are complex, and animals their minds are unfamiliar to us, they're hard to understand. There's all these challenges, right, to really improving their lives meaningfully at scale in a responsible way that does have a net positive impact, doesn't lead to unforeseen trophic cascades or effects like that. But there's no reason to think that those are unsolvable problems. They're just hard problems. And these are the kinds of problems that science can solve. So that's why when I think about the tractability of this cause area, I think the thing to think about is capacity building. What we can be doing right now is we can be doing research and institution building that enables us to tackle these problems sooner and more effectively in the future. That brings us to Wild Animal Initiative. So Wild Animal Initiative was founded explicitly to respond to the fact that there is a paucity of programs we can scale up right now, but there is a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit in terms of research. There are so few people that have asked these questions before that finding the answers to them becomes shockingly easy. So we're here to do the easy work. um, our theory of change, just broadly, right, is that we want to get to these interventions at scale. Before we can do that, we're going to need a body of scientific research from a bunch of different disciplines, which we are loosely calling right now welfare biology, right? So welfare biology asks questions like, which species are sentient? What are their lives like in the wild? And how can humans responsibly improve their lives? So I'm just going to go through a few of the projects that we've been working on, that we're going to continue working on this year, just to give you a sense of what this field could look like. So a lot of our projects fall under the bucket of theory, right? So these are things where we're often playing around with models. We're not looking at real animal populations. We don't have a lot of data. It's often pretty simple equations. But it's really surprising how much you can learn from these toy models, because even in the absence of data, they can highlight relationships that set priorities for future research. So the model that's pictured here on the screen is the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. If you've taken an ecology course, you've probably seen something like this before. It's a classic example of population modeling, where you have the snowshoe hare and the Canada lynx, right? They're kind of a poster children predator-prey here. As the snowshoe hare population goes up, the lynx who prey upon them, their population goes up as well, right? Because there's more food. As the predator population increases, the prey population decreases. When the prey population decreases, the predator population decreases. So you get these nice, cute little curves. And so that's a very simple model. It has a bunch of assumptions. One way you can make that model more realistic is you can add in other things that affect the prey population, right? So snowshoe hares don't only have to worry about evading Canada lynx, they also have to worry about finding enough food for themselves. And as their population grows, there's a density dependence to their population growth, right? So as their population grows, it becomes harder to find food because they're competing with each other for food. And so some of them start to starve while others are being predated upon. So that's another factor. There are a whole bunch of different variations like this that have already been done on this model. Like I said, it's a classic system in population ecology. But as far as we could tell, and we looked, as far as we could tell, no one actually took this model and said, okay, wait, so when we're talking about hares dying by starvation and dying by predation, how many are dying of each cause, right? So we had models that gave us the total hare population, but not models that told us how many were starving, how many were being eaten. And from the perspective of a snowshoe hare, that's a big difference. I actually don't know which is better, starving or being eaten, but they seem like very different ways to die. And both seem like potentially quite painful things, like major events in your life. If I was a hare, I would want to know what is going to happen to me. That's the kind of welfare perspective that has yet to be brought to the population modeling theory world yet. So this handsome gentleman in the corner here is Anthony DiGiovanni, who was a research fellow with us last summer. And I got his graduation picture up here because he was just out of undergrad, right? So he was basically charting entirely new territory in ecological theory right out of undergrad, wrote a couple lines of code just to answer this simple question: what are hares dying of? And we're continuing to build on that model this year, applying it to different situations, filling it in with empirical data. But I just think it's so cool that he was able to answer this fundamental question so easily. And it's just such a great example of how easy it is to find answers when no one has looked for them before. So it's not all, just toy models. It's also real world stuff. And some of the real world stuff we're interested in is influencing policymakers, broadly construed, right? So that could be government policymakers. It could be people in nonprofits or academia, but anyone who sort of manages large resources or institutions. And again, as I mentioned, there are not a lot of programs right now that we can advise being implemented in the field. But I think there's still a lot we can do in terms of bringing these issues to the minds of policymakers and incorporating these values in decision-making systems. So one way to do that could be through the One Health research paradigm. So I don't know, well, I mean, you've probably heard of the CDC, right? Center for Disease Control is Colby College's ultimate Frisbee team. But what you may not know is it was named after an obscure government bureau named the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So that CDC is one of the many institutions worldwide that uses the One Health paradigm to link human and animal health in a way to protect public health, being aware of the environment that it exists in. Now, this is still a pretty anthropocentric research framework right now, right? Because it's ultimately about how do we protect human health. And so pretty much the entire discipline of wildlife disease ecology, which exists as a discipline. There are plenty of people researching wildlife disease, but most of them aren't researching the impact that that disease has on the wildlife themselves. Dr. Sandra Halsey is the rare exception to that. So she's the one pictured here. She's a collaborator of ours at the University of Missouri. We co-wrote a paper with her last year. Her lab is devoted to computational ecology that studies the burden of disease on wildlife. Of course, she also throws in the human connection there because that's a great way to get funding. But she's really interested in knowing, when we talk about Lyme disease, we know that deer are also vectors for those ticks and that those ticks can get to humans, but how bad is that for the deer? So I think this whole framework of the One Health policy and research paradigm is a great way to find people with the skills to inform these kinds of questions, while simultaneously possibly providing an avenue towards directing more funding towards these questions, possibly providing a way to start to get the people at the CDC or other sort of public health agencies, perhaps considering their mandate a bit more broadly and thinking about how their policies affect not just humans, but other sentient feeling individuals in the system. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today is applications, finally, right? So I've really been beating around this bush for a while now because as I mentioned before, I really think the way to think about wild animal welfare is that we're going to get better and better at it, and the majority of the benefits, the majority of the animals we're going to help are probably going to be animals that live in the future, in the next 10, 100, who knows how many years. And we really, for their sake, need to keep our eyes focused on that prize of how do we scale up to long-term, large-scale, viable interventions. That being said, it's not like there's nothing we can do now. And it's not like that we don't want to get our hands dirty, right? Because starting to apply some of the lessons we're learning, even at a small scale, can really inform the direction that research and policy and capacity building takes over the long term. So one intervention that we're really excited about is replacing the lethal control of urban pigeon populations with fertility control. So you probably know that many cities regularly kill rats because they consider them pests. You might not know that they're also killing pigeons. They're putting out poison to keep their populations down. There is already an alternative to that you can buy a bag of ovo control, which is pigeon food that has a fertility drug in it that reduces the fertility of the birds that eat it. And if you dose this the right way, you can actually get the pigeon populations managed at the same total level as you would through a lethal control program. But instead of having lots of pigeons born, some of whom you kill, poison to death, instead you just have fewer pigeons born in the first place. So this is exciting to us for a variety of reasons. And the most obviously, it seems like it probably improves welfare, right? It seems like it's probably better to not have to kill as many birds. It's also something, as I mentioned, that exists already. We seem to have the technology. We're looking into the cost effectiveness of it. It might be that the technology could be improved, but this isn't a far future thing. This is, if not this year, within the next few years, I don't see any reason why most cities in the US couldn't be using this. So it's a program we're interested in scaling up. And in the process of scaling it up, again, touching on that policy point, we could really engage municipal decision makers in considering wild animal welfare as part of their mandate of what they're doing as policymakers, right? They're not just there to represent voters, but they're there to represent all constituents in their districts, right? Just like they represent children who can't vote for them, they should also represent wild animals who can't vote for them. And then finally, I find this a very exciting program because fertility control, it seems like it could help pigeons a lot, but it seems like it could help a lot of animals a lot, right? Anytime where we want to find something that's a large source of suffering in the wild, right? That's often going to be associated with causes of death, right? So you have a particularly painful disease like rabies. Rabies not only causes animals to suffer, but also causes them to die. If you were to develop a vaccine for that disease, then that would be great. Those animals wouldn't have to suffer, but it might lead to an increase in the total population. That increase could either be directly bad because of the effects it has on other animal populations, or it might just cause a lot of uncertainty, right? We know that when one animal population increases, others can decrease, and that can kind of cascade like dominoes. This is what's called a trophic cascade. And it's just really hard to predict the effects of that. So better understanding fertility control, having a broader toolkit of fertility methods that we could apply to many species and many systems would kind of multiply the kinds of interventions that we can sustainably and safely and predictably implement in the wild, because we can pair fertility control with reduction in painful causes of death to reduce those painful causes of death without rocking the boat and changing the population dramatically. So I could go on and on about all my feelings about wild animal welfare and what I think about the ethics of it, and all the ideas we have for research and collaborations. But I think I'm going to cut it off for now and leave time for questions. I just want to highlight some opportunities to stay involved in this conversation. So we put all of our research up on our website, right? wildanimalinitiative.org. I would encourage you to go to that same website /newsletter to sign up for our newsletter. We're none of us like having full inboxes. We're trying to be pretty respectful of people's inboxes, so it's normally only about one email a month. And also, if any of this was interesting to you, particularly sort of the ethics and social implications, I would really encourage you to check out our Wildness podcast. It's a pretty cool project. It was just 4 short but sweet episodes by Maya LaPearl, who is a podcaster we met who didn't know much about wild animal welfare. And we said, hey, would you mind just recording yourself as you learn? And in the process, she got the opinions of just like a really cool set of researchers and thinkers and activists from all across the spectrum. So would highly recommend checking that out. And then finally, the details aren't quite up yet, but this Saturday at 11:30 a.m., we're actually going to be taking this conversation to the next level at the weekly Effective Environmentalism virtual meetup. So if you go on Facebook, you'll see there's an Effective Environmentalism group. You can ask to join the group. You'll have to be approved by the moderators first. And then I've just been talking with them. They're still setting up the Zoom link and all of that. But basically the plan is at 11:30, we're going to have a discussion about the intersection between wild animal welfare and effective environmentalism. So we're going to review a little bit of this, maybe 10 minutes at most of the intro stuff, but we're going to try to take the conversation to the next level by discussing environmental ethics in the context of animal ethics, going on to applications. How does climate change affect wild animals? How do our climate change mitigation efforts affect wild animals? How could we take those in directions that could hurt or help wild animals? How do we prioritize amongst all these different urgent environmental crises? Those kinds of things. So if you want to continue the conversation beyond 5:20 today, that would be the place to go. So thanks so much, and I'll open up for questions.